For 14 years, from 1954 to 1968, millions of Americans took to the streets demanding equal and fair treatment for all, independent of whether a person's skin was brown or white. Today, looking back on the civil rights movement, history often remembers the highlights, moments like Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, or when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus, leading to the weeks-long Montgomery bus boycott. But what about the lesser-known events and people behind the movement? One of these faces is James Meredith. He led the 1966 March Against Fear, an organized walk to protest the violence African Americans faced at the polls while trying to legally vote. The on-foot journey from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi ended up taking a grueling 21 days to complete.
James Meredith, who had made a reputation for himself 4 years earlier by integrating Ole Miss, announced that he was going to walk from Memphis to Jackson, Mississippi, through his home state of Mississippi. And he was doing this, he said, because he was tired of being afraid of white people, and he wanted to show that you didn't need to have that fear anymore, that history had moved on.
That's Ann Bossum, author of the book, The March Against Fear, The Last Great Walk of the Civil Rights Movement and the Emergence of Black Power. She says the march, intended to show that Black people didn't need to be afraid anymore, took on a more ominous meaning almost immediately.
He started this walk June the 5th, and on June the 6th, the first day after he'd crossed into Mississippi, he was ambushed and shot by a white man. And he didn't die, but he was injured enough so that he couldn't continue. And as was the tradition in that era, the civil rights movement coalesced to show that an act of violence would not go unanswered and to complete his walk.
The other civil rights leaders who took up the walk for Meredith included Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Stokely Carmichael. Their presence brought a lot of attention and additional marchers. As the march grew, the risk involved grew with it.
There was that underlying concern that there might be further violence, attacks leveled at the marchers. The Mississippi state authorities, law enforcement authorities, were tasked with trying to keep the marchers safe. And because there was a large contingent of news media witnessing the whole thing, and because negative publicity was bad for the state, reluctantly or not, this essentially all-white force did try to provide some safety. But that patience began to wear thin, and near the end of the march in Canton, Mississippi, the state troopers from Mississippi actually tear gassed and began beating a group of protesters who are standing their ground on a public school grounds, demanding the right to camp there as citizens trying to use public property.
Once the march was over, organizers had hopes that it would become a catalyst for great change, something that ultimately never occurred.
It fell far short of its mission, and that was an impediment to launching future marches. There had been hope that after this march there would be more legislation, just like the Voting Rights Act had followed the previous year's march from Selma to Montgomery, and that didn't materialize.
Though its goals were left incomplete, Bossum says its historic reach cannot be denied. First, it was one of the final events to unite Dr. King and his more radical counterpart, Stokely Carmichael.
Stokely Carmichael was a young man when he joined the civil rights movement in the early 60s and became a freedom rider and so forth. By 1966, he was frustrated with the slow pace of change. Martin Luther King was just enough older to perhaps have more patience, and his personality lent itself to that as well. But their differences were, to some extent, they were a good counterpoint to one another. Martin Luther King was cooler. Carmichael was fiery. They enjoyed one another. There was not animosity between them. They helped, between the two of them, to cover a broader base in the movement than either one of them might have been able to cover alone.
Bossum says the march is also remembered for being where Carmichael coined the term Black Power, which became a rallying cry for the civil rights movement.
During the march, Stokely Carmichael, partway through, debuted the Black Power phrase on the national stage. So the emergence of Black Power, on its most basic level, is the emergence of this phrase and this concept that took on different meanings depending on who was listening to it. So the idea of having power might have sounded really good if you were in Mississippi and you'd spent your whole life living in a county where African Americans were the majority population but had never once held an elected office. If you're in a different part of the country and you're not interested in sharing your power at all, then Black power may not sound like a good idea to you in any situation. And so this concept and this term began to take on different meanings around the country and fed into the Black Panther movement. And that Black power phrase caught the nation's attention in ways that affected the civil rights movement going forward, that began to make it harder for the various organizations in the civil rights movement to speak with one voice as frustrations mounted over the slow pace of social change and people began calling for greater action.
And Bossum says that call for greater action continues to inspire protesters to this day.
The March Against Fear, as I said, did not end with this great uplift that people had hoped for. And it exposed these wounds from the legacy of slavery that the nation just wasn't ready to face. And it chose to push a lot of these issues out of sight, hoping they would go away. And we've learned over time that that doesn't work. So issues that were left unresolved have come forward again. The Black Lives Matter movement is a continuing legacy from that early Black Power cry in 1966. And I suspect this new movement will persevere or be followed by others until that unfinished legacy of slavery and the toll it's taken on the nation is truly faced.
That unceasing call for equality is something that James Meredith, the man who began the March to End Fear, has continued fighting for his whole life.
He went back in 1967 to complete the part of the walk that he had missed. He said to me when I met with him that he did that because he needed to prove to himself that he wasn't afraid. And he's repeated the entire walk again on various anniversaries or parts of it and undertaken other walks. So he continues to try to influence people with his feet.
And finally, the march is remembered because of its scale.
The year before, the march from Selma to Montgomery in Alabama had lasted 5 days. This one lasted 22. That one covered 54 miles. This one, with a big detour added, was over 300. So just the logistical scale of it makes it remarkable. As a child, I actually witnessed a small part of the march. That memory was not fully connected up with the history, but in my adulthood, I was able to think those up.
She says she now hopes her book can resonate in the minds of a new generation of thinkers and hopefully can stay with them and their parents, as it stuck with her.
I feel very strongly that we need honest history that is willing to look even at the tough stuff and show that fights can be difficult so that when young people go out into the world, they're ready for that. They haven't been fed a candy-coated version of how the world works.
To learn more about this topic and our guest, Ann Bossum, head to viewpointsradio.org. This segment originally aired in February 2017 and was written by producer Pat Reuter. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. Our studio manager is Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson.